All right, it's 12:01, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, thank you all for joining our sixth session for our Capture Falls Learning Cohort. My name is Amber Kavan. I'm the HQIC Quality Improvement Advisor with the NHA, working closely with Margaret and Dana. So today we're going to talk about some improvement efforts that have been made and the post-fall clinical assessment. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. If you could all mute your lines, we'd greatly appreciate it. We do want today to be open discussion, so feel free to unmute yourself at any point if you have something you'd like to share or have questions. And if you all wouldn't mind just adding your name, your team, whoever's joining today into the chat box, we'd greatly appreciate it. All of these sessions are recorded, so you can find those on the NHA website. If you missed a session or you want to re-listen, you can find them on the NHA website. So I will hand it off to you, Dawn.
Okay, welcome everybody. So as Amber said, this is session number 6, and we are hopefully want to start with some audience participation. Perhaps we don't have any polling or anything like that we had from last time, but what we hope to have is maybe people willing to share what they've been working on. If you had a chance to go through a PDSA cycle recently, kind of share your experience with that. Fall risk reduction is not easy work, and we're looking at this in a very short amount of time. And so we're looking for people that are maybe willing to share some potential small wins with us, or if there are some challenges that you've encountered, use some crowdsourcing and get some advice from each other that way as well. Okay, so to kind of jumpstart the audience sharing, we came up with some of these questions here, just to share with the group, and you may do that in the chat, or if you want to do that verbally, unmute yourself. What have you guys been working on? What have people been working on, and what, have you seen any early wins? Have you seen any challenges? And then, do you need advice on how to move forward? So those are kind of some of the food for thought kinds of questions that we would like to throw out there. And so I'll just pause for a moment and see if anybody's willing to share.
Well, this is Amanda from Saunders Medical Center. We did put out a fall risk audit form. We put it together collaboratively with our group here for the fall cohort. And we all kind of put input. Some of the questions for the audit were, are the signs posted? Is the patient aware of their own fall risk? Is the call light within reach? The room decluttered? Gate belt, bed alarm used, and such. So we posted this weekly at the nurses station, and then also other participants with pharmacy and with therapy were given those audits as well and turned those in each Friday at the end of the week. And I thought it was really good. It was good for self-awareness. We did see a trend more that they weren't always aware of their own fall risk, and that we could improve on using our bed or chair alarms a little bit more.
Yeah, audits serve many purposes. I mean, they give you information about how well your program is working, but the thing that stuck out to me, what you said, is that it increased awareness. And so, you almost can think of an audit as like a staff education intervention too, to try to keep things kind of at the forefront of people's minds. So thank you for sharing, Amanda.
So thanks for sharing that, Amanda. If you don't mind me asking, what thoughts has your team had about how to address the patient's perhaps lack of awareness of their fall risk?
Well, that'll be our next. I told them that we would collect this for the next month for an audit, and then we would meet together as a group to kind of tackle where the needs are and what suggestions the group had for process improvement. And so that'll be done in the next couple weeks. So
That sounds great.
Yeah, it sounds like you'll have some nice baseline data
Mhm.
to compare to.
yeah, I was really pleased with the overall participation from staff with it. I felt like I was really glad to see the engagement.
Great. All right, Stephanie Moody says TCHS has been working on ensuring interventions are proactive and according to the Morse Fall scores. We've been doing well with this, and our 100 days today is 100 days falls free. So congratulations on that. So I assume you must have like, you know, certain scores, certain cut points with the Morse and bundles of interventions that go along with those certain cut points. Is that how you address your interventions? We can't hear you if you're trying to unmute yourself, Stephanie.
Can you hear me now?
I can, yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We took the Morris Fall scores and we kind of scheduled them out to what was low, medium, and high risk. And then we used those medium, high risk to set our interventions so that the staff knew exactly what interventions to put into place if a patient falls within a certain range on the Morris Fall score. And then we put the color of star to match either a high or medium risk outside the door so that the staff would know across the board that this patient is a medium risk, so they should be having these interventions in place. And then the interventions are on a laminated card inside the rooms at the computer so that the staff can verify that their interventions are in place according to our protocol.
Great. It sounds like you've got some
It's
good.
actually working really well.
Yeah, it sounds like you've got some good, you know, kind of memory aid types of setup to help staff remember. You know, certainly bundling certain interventions like that makes it crystal clear to everybody what interventions should be linked to those different fall categories that you have. Do the nurses, do they have any autonomy to potentially change things, however? So like say if, you know, I guess like where do alarms fall, using alarms as an example? Do those fall under the high risk category, or are those already in place for medium?
I believe we had that set up for the medium. We
Okay.
kind of let the nurses know that there may be a time that you need to remove one or two, or that you may come to a point in time that you feel that this needs to be more. So we have them doing the Morris Fall every shift.
Okay.
So they adjust according to their Morris Fall for the shift.
Okay. Yeah, because fall risk can definitely change. And I guess my point though is that you know, to give them the autonomy to maybe add or take interventions away if, you know, the score is nice and it's easy and it's clean, but you also want to make sure that the interventions are matching the impairments. And so, you know, let's just say, for example, let's say alarms weren't necessarily part of your medium category. But somebody scored in the medium category, but they had a cognitive impairment where they weren't understanding that they needed to ask for help when they were getting up. So like, so this would be if alarms wasn't until they hit high risk, for example, you know, making sure nurses have the clinical autonomy to potentially add more interventions, even though they don't necessarily match the bundle of interventions that goes with a certain score. So hopefully I'm making sense as I'm explaining that. So bundling is easy and great, and it makes it crystal clear for everybody, but also being judicious about making sure the interventions are matching the particular things that come up on the Morse that are the actual risk factors. So like example, you know, if incontinence is an issue, toileting schedule should be part of the interventions even if it doesn't necessarily fit the bundle of interventions that go along with that specific score. So am I explaining this very well? Hopefully I am.
Yes, you do. That does make sense. And yes, we have given the nurses the ability to add more interventions if needed. We really discourage them from jumping to the fact of removing an intervention without verifying that across the board everybody is in agreement with that, because what one person may see may be different than another. So we really are wanting the nurses to do really good communication in regards to this and make sure they're communicating it every shift and within their shift, because even as we're having our patients and taking care of them, a lot of times it's a different nurse that's walking in. So it's critical that the staff are communicating with each other what the fall score is for that day, and that they are using the correct intervention.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely, I think that this applies way more, like having the autonomy to change the bundle applies way more to adding things than taking away. It's like you wouldn't want somebody to potentially take something away and maybe their clinical judgment wasn't very sound, or maybe they were missing something. And then they're not following policy and somebody falls like that. That would be bad from a risk management standpoint. So probably more applicable to adding on extra stuff than taking something away that would be then against policy, unless like you said, unless
we discovered, is he gone?
I don't know.
Oh.
This isn't even a remotely a tip.
Just a reminder to mute unless you're sharing with the group.
Okay, I was like, are those mine?
Have you tried to call Dan?
I don't think I have I don't know, Dana, do you have the ability to mute people?
I do. I'm working on it.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
All right. So yeah, thank you, Amanda and Stephanie, for sharing that. What else? What have other people been working on and doing?
This is Amber. I had some hospitals share some success stories with me, so I will kind of go ahead and share on their behalf if that's okay.
Okay.
So the first story I want to share is from Providence. Valerie shared with me that we all know that fall improvement is kind of a continuous cycle of improvement. So I know this cohort is short and only a couple months, but since it's a continuous improvement effort, I'm going to share these stories, even though it may not have been just within this 3-month time frame. So what Providence Medical Center did, they identified that their fall rate was increasing, and they just created an informal goal to reduce falls in their hospital. So what they did was participated in a pilot study for HQIC, which HQIC uses cameras and an algorithm to predict patient movement and alerts the nursing staff to prevent falls. And what they also did was reviewed their pressure alarm functionality with the assumption that there was the potential for malfunction or use of these alarms. So what they studied during this PDSA cycle is that HQIC offered data in which prevented patient falls by predicting the patient movement and notifying the nursing staff, and that with their pressure alarm pads, they were often out of batteries or turned off. So the actions that they made during this model for improvement was that they made an official contract with HQIC and implemented video patient monitoring in patient rooms on a regular basis. And they also purchased all new pressure alarm pads. And these new pads featured, they had features for low battery monitoring and an on and off switch. So they also purchased these pressure alarm pads for both the chair and the toilet. And they put each of these pads in each patient room so they were available upon admission. So after implementing all of this, they had several wins, and they noticed that they had an unexpected win with the video surveillance by being able to monitor patient safety for patients that were in isolation rooms. And not only did they improve patient safety, but they also were able to reduce PPE waste. And then the new pressure alarm pads were easily implemented and used in multiple settings that include the bathroom. So we all know that a lot of falls do occur in the bathroom. So I think this was a huge win for them by implementing a pressure alarm for the toilet. And then overall, they've reduced their fall rate and their general fall awareness with their staff. So lots of small wins. And I think this is a great example of how hospitals can improve by just making some small changes. And I know Valerie's on. Do you want to chime in, Valerie, and let me know what I missed?
Do you know by what percent they decrease their fall rate?
That would have to be a question for Valerie. Are you able to unmute, Val? Or maybe she jumped off. Valerie, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
If she has access to the chat, Valerie, you can always put your response in the chat as well.
Well, Amber, as you pointed out, Mallory, at their organization, they had like numerous like small wins. So in this cohort, that's one of the things that we're just like looking at. If we can have just a bunch of small wins, those really add up. So if anyone on the call just has just can share just like a small win that you had, maybe promoting, or I guess just promoting, looking at what interventions are in place, or just bringing it more to the forefront, like a concentration or an effort to look at some organizational factors that could be contributing to falls.
This is Kristen at Faith Regional in Norfolk, and since we provided additional education to all staff, which would include like our housekeeping staff, our dietary staff, we've had a lot of good catches from those two departments, including our maintenance staff, that are more aware of what the signs are, everything that we're implementing, the yellow wristbands, and they're safely escorting the patients back to the bed and then contacting nursing for additional help. So good catches there.
That's a great example of a small win, just bringing that awareness. That's great. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. That's a great example too of how something like broad education on fall risk reduction can help to communicate that fall risk reduction is a team sport, and it's something that everyone can contribute to. It's not just the responsibility of nursing, but really everyone can play a big and a small role in helping to keep our patients safe. So congratulations on those early wins you've had, and keep up the good work there.
Yeah, I would agree that too often it falls on the shoulders of nurses, and it really is an organizational goal to reduce fall risk. And so having those non-clinical staff know something about your program. I mean, obviously you don't need to educate them on how to do the Morse, for example, but even just knowing what the signage means. So that way, if they spot somebody who's up and moving around or is trying to get out of bed, they can hit the call light, they can go get a staff member who is qualified to physically assist them. That is a great example of making it an organizational wide effort as well. I want to go back and make a comment about the pressure pads alarms in the bathroom. Well, first of all, I had never heard of such a thing. I didn't even know until hearing the story that there was a pressure alarm that could be. Valerie says, sorry, I'm computer microphone illiterate. It's fine. It's fine. Valerie, if you do have any data on I think the question was reduction in fall rates, if you have the numbers, any actual numbers to share. I think that was the question from before. You could just drop that in the chat. But anyway, I'm just saying I'm super impressed by the fact that such a thing even exists as a pressure sensing device in the bathroom, because bathrooms are absolutely a risky situation. We've got published research that shows that risk of injury in a fall that happens in the bathroom is actually 2.5 times greater than falls that happen in other locations in the hospital. And so, presumably that's because it's a tight spot. There's not a lot of room. And so if you're going to go down, you're probably hitting a sink or a toilet or at least a wall on the way down, which can cause some significant injury. So bathrooms are risky places, but they're places people need to be on a regular basis. And a lot of hospitals have, safety will trump privacy, and staff will stay with the patient in the bathroom if they're at high fall risk, and especially if they're at high injury risk. The alarms kind of help with another layer of protection and supervision for those patients. So that's really, really helpful and useful to know. So I don't know, Valerie, I'm not necessarily into endorsing certain products, but if there's I don't know if anybody would be interested in the brand of those, you could drop that in the chat. So, okay, so she put in the chat 4 falls in the second quarter, and then they implemented Acuvera, and no third quarter, only 1 fall, she says. So the numbers went down. The other comment I'll make about fall rates is that sometimes it takes a long time for actual rates. So like if you're looking at rate per 1,000 patient day, which is the preferred way to track progress in falls over time, that can take some time to come down. And so realize that improvements in your processes and even just improvements in staff awareness are measurable gains, and are things that you should be looking for and celebrating as well, because especially for those of you who are at small hospitals who are on the call, your patient census might be so low, you might not have many falls period, just because you aren't going to have the census of like a Nebraska Medicine 500 plus bed hospital will. And so you might not see huge changes in fall rates over time just because of the small numbers. And so realize that improvements in processes and getting better structures in place are also improvements that can be celebrated and touted to hospital leadership and families and patients and staff as well. So it doesn't always have to be about the numbers. Yeah.
Well, and something else on that point, on what we have noticed in Capture Falls is when increased awareness is brought to the issue of falls, we have fall rates increase. Not that they're doing things worse, but just that awareness and, oh, that's a fall, I should probably report that. But just then looking at every single fall as an opportunity to learn from maybe what could have been done better, or if there's something in your organizational processes that could have been changed, things like that. So yes, while looking at fall rates, it could give you like a picture of that. Also be aware that it might not be a bad thing if your overall fall rate increases.
Yeah, some hospitals that have gone through Capture Falls with us over the years, like their fall rates will increase. And it's maybe because they weren't counting assisted falls at first. And the definition of a fall in their organization might have been a bit nebulous. And so not everybody was on the same page about what counted as a fall. You know, does a fall back into a chair count as a fall? Technically, yes, it's a descent that was unplanned to a lower surface if they weren't planning on sitting down already. And so if the definition wasn't really, you know, reliably applied, you might have been missing falls. And so that would be the reason that fall rates might look like they go up initially for hospitals that are really focusing a lot on falls you know, for a while. So assisted falls are something that, again, some hospitals weren't necessarily counting. And so, but those are in your total fall rate. So something to keep in mind there. All right, so the other thing we have planned today is to go through some things about post-fall clinical assessment, which would be if a patient does fall, even despite our best efforts, if somebody falls, kind of what are the next steps in terms of assessing for injury. And so I've got some resources that I want to share with you that are from, you know, really reputable resources about some guidance on what to do and maybe what to consider in your policies and your protocols with that. So that's the other part of today's presentation. But I just want to make sure that if there's anybody else that had anything that they wanted to share, whether it's just, hey, this is what we're working on, or if somebody had a question, if, you know, to make sure that we honor the time that we want to have for that. So I'll just pause for a moment here. Oh, Kristen asked, how do you set your fall rate goal? Do you benchmark it against your previous rates, or is it set against a national benchmark? So, Anne, do you want to address this one? I'm actually, while you're doing that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. I need to, before I get started presenting the other content, I need to change some things on my computer. So I'll let you answer that while I take care of the AV, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's a great question, Kristen. So in Capture Falls, we attempted to, in 2012, we collected fall rates from the state of Nebraska. So we had a statewide fall benchmark. And then also we were able to create a critical access hospital fall benchmark. So if you're looking at benchmarks, it would be good to look to your peer group. One of the big issues is there really is no published critical access hospital like benchmark. So we believe we might be like the first to have that benchmark. Unfortunately, it's hard to collect that consistently every year. So those in the collaborative, we do have a benchmark for critical access hospitals that we could share with anyone that would like that. But it's good to look at your a national benchmark, or as big as you can. However, looking within your organization from year to year, you know, then you also need to look at your denominator, like your patient days and how those change. But looking internally is good to see how you're doing. But then if you want to compare to maybe you could be doing better like these other hospitals. Another thing to bring awareness to is that definition of a fall that we just talked about before. So sometimes if you don't know other people's definitions to falls, you could be comparing apples to oranges. So if you are comparing to national, just make sure you know what they're counting as a fall. So sometimes you just see injurious fall rates. Sometimes you see, as Dawn mentioned, not including assisted falls. One of the measures that we started collecting was unassisted fall rates. And that is actually a pretty good way to compare with others. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to your simple question. But if anyone has any questions, please let us know. We'd be happy to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, maybe we can share with the group because we had just, you know, the 2020 benchmarks, we can maybe share the Capture Falls benchmarks with the group. I don't see why we can't. So, because it's aggregate data, it's not anybody's individual fall rates for sure. And I think Kristen had said that she's from Faith Regional, if I remember right. So that you're not even, you're technically not a critical access hospital either. And so you're kind of in that in-betweener, you're a smaller hospital, but not as small as a critical access hospital. NDNQI is a national organization that a lot of hospitals will, participate in, reporting to the National Database for Nursing Quality Indicators. And they have benchmarks and base it on hospital size. I think the smallest category though is 100 beds and less, which I would assume Faith Regional probably falls into. I don't know exactly how many beds you guys have, but 131. So you'd be close to that one. So that they publish national benchmarks. I'll tell you, like, it's always generally for like general medical types of patients, it's always usually between like 3 to 5 falls per 1,000 patient days is what the number usually is around that area. That's what I've seen published most frequently. So I don't know if does anybody have any other comments about national benchmarks or places that they use to compare besides just to themselves over time?
No, I don't have a comment on that. I was just going to comment on the thinking also as you think through all these considerations for how you set your fall rate goal, also thinking about just carefully about the ways we communicate what those goals are to staff, especially if your goal or your benchmark is on total fall rates. As we mentioned, we typically look at assisted falls as evidence of success, and we want people to report those, especially if it's assisted and uninjurious, because that's we got to someone in time and we followed our processes. One of the things we don't want to happen is for staff to feel like they shouldn't report falls or they don't want to report falls because they don't want to be the person that breaks the 90-day streak, the 120-day streak, the 200-day streak. So just as you consider what you want your goals to be, just thinking carefully about what that messaging is around that, so that we're framing it as here's all these things we're doing to help achieve and meet our fall rate goals or be below the benchmark, instead of inadvertently creating incentives for people to not report falls when they do occur.
The other thing that, focusing on like a total fall rate might inadvertently promote is not mobilizing patients too. So I'm a physical therapist, so I'm all about getting people out of bed and moving. And so if the implicit message is like, I don't want to get that patient up and moving because they might fall while I'm with them, that's not going to do patients any good in the long run either. So is to let them languish in bed on bed rest and not get them up and moving. So looking at an unassisted fall, like when was the last time we had an unassisted fall? Because those are like the worst ones. People are more at risk for injury with unassisted falls. That means that we didn't know the patient was getting up and moving around. We weren't with them, just we didn't have alarms in place. We weren't doing rounding enough, or we didn't have the skills on how to safely mobilize them. So we weren't. Those are really the ones that we want to prevent. And assisted fall means that, like Vicki said, we're in the right place at the right time. We have the right skill set to physically assist that patient with their mobility. And sometimes people are going to go down, but they're going to be less at risk for injury if it's a controlled fall in that fashion. So those aren't necessarily bad things, those assisted falls. And so, yeah, focusing on having the unassisted fall rate be your primary goal will help. So you're not sending an implicit message that you either want to discourage reporting or discourage mobilization of patients as well. So, all right, anything else? This is great. I love just kind of this free-flowing discussion. This was like our open office hour a month or so ago, and it was fun. It was so fun just to talk falls with people. All right, well, hearing none, I'll go ahead and I guess just keep moving then. And we'll talk a little bit about, like, if somebody does fall, unfortunately, what should we do? Okay, so I've got some resources for you there. So we're talking about post-fall clinical assessment. And the reason we're talking about this is because this was a topic identified in the gap analysis that you guys did way at the beginning of this cohort as a topic that people wanted to know more about. And so we'll talk about post-fall clinical assessment. So this is different than a post-fall huddle. Post-fall huddle was the other topic that people wanted to learn more about, was how to do huddles. Huddle is, you get together and talk and figure out what went wrong and why did this particular patient fall and how do we prevent them from falling again? And has this fall pointed to something kind of bigger picture that we need to address across the organization? That's really the purpose of a post-fall huddle. Post-fall clinical assessment actually should occur before the huddle even occurs, because you're attending to that patient's immediate medical needs and determining whether or not they actually got hurt during that fall. And so that's what I'm talking about when I say post-fall clinical assessment. And so you're doing it immediately, even before the huddle, and that assessment might, depending on the patient's risk factors, might have to continue for several hours afterwards as well. Okay. So one of the things we did several months ago is critical access hospitals that work with us in Capture Falls, we asked people to share, what do you do? What is your post-fall policy? And so this slide here shows, this is percentage of policies, and these are the different things that showed up in people's policy. And, people, identified, for example, that yes, we do a post-fall huddle. Everybody was documenting. 100% of the policies said, okay, we got to document what happened. Things like notifying the family, notifying the MD. And when it came to explicitly saying we assess the patient for injury, nearly 90% of the policies actually said that. So it was a common element of people's policies. And some of the policies, there's a variety of detail within these policies, but when assessment was explicitly described in these policies, people went on to detail that. And the most common things that was stated in the policy that we would assess were vital signs, not surprising, pain, again, not surprising, and the presence of injury, which maybe you're looking for deformities, bruising, lacerations, bleeding, and so on, okay? And then these were some of the other specific items that were mentioned, okay? So Ann and Vicki and I are not risk managers, and so we don't have a ton of experience when it comes to what is good policy, how much detail should be in a policy. So I'm not sure if anybody who maybe is a risk manager has any comments about, I could see where it's like, okay, you want a lot of detail in your policies and procedures because then your staff knows exactly what to do and what is expected. At the same time, if there's so much detail and then something gets missed, does that put your hospital at risk? Like, well, you didn't follow your policy and, some really adverse event happened. So I don't know, does anybody have any comment about how much detail in something like this is enough or desirable? Any thoughts about that from the audience? Again, we're not experts in policy writing or risk management necessarily, so not quite sure what the right answer is. Maybe nobody else knows the answer either. There might be different philosophies about that, so. All right, well, hearing no comments from the audience, I'll go ahead and move on. There are 4, so that was, again, a sample of policies that we received from some critical access hospitals that work in Capture Falls with us. These are some other reputable resources that have tools that you can use when you are developing policies and procedures for post-fall clinical assessment. So there's a couple from the US, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and then the VA. And then there's a couple of resources from organizations, governmental organizations in Australia. And Australia is really good with fall risk reduction. There's a lot of resources, whether it's inpatient or community-based older adults and fall risk reduction for that population. Australia really has a lot of good information out there. And so I'm going to be highlighting some things that show up on these 4 resources. And I've got the links there for you again, you can go to the original source and look at this more thoroughly, but I'm just going to kind of hit some of the highlights for you today. And I'll start with the 2 resources from the United States here. Okay. So the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, they have a post-fall assessment clinical review is what they call the tool. And again, I've got the link for you here. And, so they make the point of really, they're kind of focused on risk of intracranial hemorrhage. And because that's, probably one of the worst things that can happen to somebody when they fall. And so the document here is explaining how to assess the patient and follow up on the injury risk in a patient who is falling. And so being knowledgeable about the risk factors for intracranial hemorrhage, and then also being aware that some of these signs might manifest themselves hours after the injury. So it's not necessarily an immediate effect if you've got kind of a slow bleed, contributing to subdural hematoma. Okay. So that is one of the big focuses here. And I've got some screenshots for some of these resources here that I'll be sharing with you. And so this is a screenshot from that web page. And I like this one because it kind of differentiates, okay, did the patient hit their head or not? Or do we even know if they hit their head or not is a big part of a lot of these tools. And so if they don't hit their head, okay, you are assessing their vitals, you're calling for help, you're not moving them until you clear the C-spine and so on. But then if you know they hit their head, or if it was unwitnessed and the patient can't tell you whether or not they struck their head, that's when you start with your neurological assessment. So that's where you see Glasgow Coma Scale start to appear in the protocol. Okay. And then, the protocol goes ahead and proceeds, and, you're cleaning wounds, you're checking blood sugar, pain control, and so on and so forth. But again, if they've hit their head or you don't know, then you're starting in with your more thorough neuro exam, okay, and considering CT scan of the head as well. And then just more screenshots, again, if they've hit their head or it's unwitnessed, then you are being more thorough and more deliberate, more frequent with those neurological observations, and definitely letting the medical providers know if there's any change in that patient's status when it comes to that. So yeah, the common theme you're going to see in all of these resources is this idea of we need to worry about intracranial hemorrhage for people who are at risk for bleeding or if they've struck their head. Okay. This is a little snippet from the VA resource. VA has a lot of good resources when it comes to fall risk reduction. I would say out of the 4 resources that I'm sharing with you today, that this is actually probably the least amount of detail that they have in their documents. But they have, and a lot of these resources too, I mean, they're focused on the assessment of injury, but they're also talking about everything else that needs to happen after somebody falls, like, a post-fall huddle and potentially pulling in PT or OT for a consult or pharmacy and so on. So it's the documents as a whole are maybe a little bit more broad. I'm kind of pulling out the injury assessment for you here today. Okay. But again, the VA is differentiating between people with and without head trauma. And so this says okay, so if they experience a fall with injury, go ahead and follow your emergency protocol. So if somebody has an obvious hip fracture, for example, where you're gonna manage that. But then in falls that, maybe don't seem as serious, there's no loss of consciousness, there's really nothing more than a bruise or a laceration. Yeah, okay, we'll go ahead and do our huddle and do our multifactorial assessment, but then it deviates again. Okay, did they hit their head? Did they, not hit their head? And again, if they struck their head even slightly, again, we're doing our neuro checks for our patients and letting the attending physician know if any changes. So again, a very common theme there. And a lot of the other similar, policy elements about checking vital signs, blood glucose, and so on. Okay. All right, so now we get to the Australian tools, and this one I didn't even take screenshots of because it's so there's so much detail. So what I have here instead is I've got the link there for you, and I'm pointing you towards some specific pages on that. So let me just see if I can get this pulled up actually. Okay, so hopefully can somebody let me know if they're seeing the PDF now? Yep, okay, thanks Vicki for the thumbs up. Okay, so, and this is fairly recent. This was just updated in 2018. So that is good. Let me get a spotlight here. So I'm gonna go ahead and again, the very globally discussing everything that happens after a patient falls, but I'm gonna focus in on a few things. So this gives a nice detailed information about, what should happen the first 48 hours after a fall. And so there's recommendations for what needs to happen immediately. And again, do we know for sure they didn't hit their head, or are they at risk for bleeding or the fall? We know they hit their head, or we don't know at all. And so that's where those neuro checks come in. So they walk you through that starting on page 5. And then it even goes through again, kind of what should happen the first 48 hours and all the communication that needs to happen as well. Okay. Page 7 kind of gets into, the history and physical examination components that would be important. And so again, you're kind of looking in at, okay, is coagulation a concern, or is one of the key things there? Spinal precautions potentially as well. And then starting on page 8, some recommendations about when should you do a CT head scan or not, and how soon. And so they're, again, kind of basing it on the presence of neurological signs, Glasgow Coma Scale score, and so on, and risk factors as well. So, this one is nice because it differentiates, let me go ahead and close this. It differentiates the course of action between, is it witnessed or unwitnessed fall? Did they strike their head or not? And are they on any kind of anticoagulants or antiplatelet medications? Very detailed document. Okay. All right. The other Australian one, also very detailed. So this is the Clinical Excellence Commission. Okay. There's an overall post-fall webpage, and then there are a few documents that I am going to highlight for you as well. And so let me pull this one up. And a lot of these are laid out for you, like almost like decision-making trees, okay? So this one, again, it's nice because it talks about like what should your immediate response be, and then ongoing observation and monitoring. And this one also includes the consideration of whether sepsis is present or delirium as well. And so there are some additional components to this resource that aren't in the others, okay? But again, otherwise it's very much focused on, again, neuro observations, whether or not a head CT should be ordered or not. And then on this one here, that now I went back to doing some screenshots for you guys. And so so that was kind of like a one sheet document. And then this document here that I have the link here for you is a little bit more thorough. It's kind of like the companion document to what I just showed you, and it explains it a little bit more thoroughly. So a feature of this one that I kind of liked is it kind of spells out potential signs of injury that you would be looking for, like, swelling, redness, shortening of a limb, restricted limb movement that might be indicative of a fracture, inability to weight bear, and so on. So it gives you some things that are still important. I mean, not focused on, intracranial hemorrhage or anything like that, but certainly injuries that we need to attend to. So it addresses those things. It also includes, of course, all those risk factors for potential head injury that we need to consider. And, again, kind of spells out issues with risk for bleeding. And so, of course, we are concerned about that with intracranial hemorrhage or subdural hematoma, but we're also concerned for potential internal bleeding or even a skin tear or a laceration if that's going to bleed quite a bit if a patient is on antiplatelets, anticoagulants, and or has other risk factors for coagulation issues with their blood. They also have an algorithm that, again, kind of guides your decision making about when should a CT potentially be ordered or not. And this, I've got just a quick screenshot of just the top of this. So let me go ahead and pull up this whole document. And so you can see here, it's a decision making tree. It kind of walks you through, are they at low risk or high risk for head injury? When should you do a CT scan? What should you do if it's normal or you don't have, one available, at least not immediately? So that is that resource. Again, so the Australian resources are really, really nice. Okay. All right, so just a couple other comments I want to make is that, we talked earlier about how unassisted falls are those that you really want to prevent. They are going to place your patients and more at risk for injury. There's actual data that shows the odds of injury are greater if a fall is unassisted than assisted. But even if they don't get hurt, they use more resources, those unassisted falls, especially if you don't know exactly what the patient hit on the way down, if they're not a good historian, if there's a cognitive impairment, they can't communicate with you very well, you're going to have to use more resources for those patients. So this was just a sample of 213 falls that critical access hospitals reported to us in 2017, and just shows that anytime there was an unassisted fall, hospitals were reporting that they had to just do a lot more. Observation, imaging, transfer to a higher level of care, and so on and so forth. Pretty much everything that you might do in response to a fall was increased if those falls were unassisted versus assisted. So just to summarize, again, those resources that I shared with you, huge focus on the brain, neurological status, bleeding, and rightfully so, because people could potentially die in those situations. So it has the most serious repercussion. Less mentioned in those resources are the maybe more minor injuries that are still important. I mean, they're still, again, using resources and potentially are contributing to lower quality of life and longer length of stay and so on. And so, we don't want our patients to have skin tears or bruising or sprains or certainly fractures and so on. And so those are less of a focus in the resources that I shared with you, but they're still really important and things that we want to try to prevent from happening, and things that bear assessment and intervention as well. Okay. So that is the end of the content that I have on post-fall clinical assessment. And again, really just trying to point you guys towards those reputable resources that look like they would be, really valuable, especially if you're starting from scratch on this. So any questions or comments from the audience about injury assessment post-fall? Okay. Hearing none, I guess the last comment I'll make about this is that, even if a patient doesn't get hurt when they fall, there's a psychological impact to it as well. I mean, so as a physical therapist, I deal with patients who develop fear of falling. And so what happens then is they start limiting their physical activity. which kind of just creates this bad cycle. Like they have deconditioning, they get weaker, they're less flexible, which just sets them up for more falls and frankly other health problems as well. That immobility and decreased mobility and lack of independence, all of those things can happen. So focused on the physical impact of falls a lot today, but there's a psychological impact as well that we want to try to prevent from happening also. Okay. Vicki, I saw you turn your camera on. Are you going to take the last couple slides, or do you want me to work through them?
Either way is fine. I can take them if you'd like.
Okay, go ahead.
Before I transition to those, I also dropped in the chat. So in addition to the slides and all the great resources that Dawn shared today, you can also visit our post-fall clinical assessment step on our falls roadmap that you may remember that we presented in session 2 for more information on the topic.
Yeah.
And that roadmap is a living document. So we're always updating it with additional resources as we come across them.
Yeah. Quite honestly, the information I presented today is what you would see on the website. I mean, it's one and the same, but
perfect.
Yeah, we wanted to share the reputable stuff with you both on our website and here today. So there's going to be redundancy, honestly, but if you lose this presentation handout, that's where you can find it.
There you go. So just a couple of wrap up items. So as we're wrapping up session 6 today, some action items for you as we prepare for our 7th and our final session, at least for this specific cohort. If you haven't yet completed an improvement cycle, we'll encourage you to still do that. You still have plenty of time to do so.
We'll begin providing behavioral health care on site at Thayer County Health Services November 30th. Jan will provide treatments such as medication management,
Amber, are you
talk
able to
therapy,
mute?
guided imagery, and much more. To schedule your appointment with Jan, call 402-768.
Anyway, you can see the session 5. Go visit the session 5 recording on the NHA website if you'd like to learn more about how you might be able to use the PDSA cycle to provide some guidance for your improvement efforts if you weren't able to attend that session. In preparation for session 7, we'll also encourage you to revisit the results of your gap analysis that we had you complete at the beginning of the cohort, or any of your auditing results that many of you have been working on, and think through maybe either some next steps. Are you ready to address your next gap? Or through the examples many of you shared today, do you need to repeat an audit to check for improvement? Is another PDSA cycle needed? So different avenues you can take in order to continue making some small but meaningful improvements with your fall risk reduction programs moving forward. And then for session 7, you want to go to that slide? Thanks, Dawn. So session 7 is on November 30th, so it'll be after Thanksgiving. We'll have kind of the other big area that was identified from the collective results of the cohort's gap analysis as an opportunity for improvement was post-fall huddles. So we'll provide some topic-specific education on that particular topic. And then spend the remainder of the time talking more with you about future areas of opportunity for continued support as you continue moving forward on your fall risk reduction improvement efforts, and some additional resources we can use to provide to you to support those improvement efforts as well. So with that, Amber or Dana, anything else you'd like to share with the cohort?
No, I think it was great discussion today. So thank you everyone for participating. And we're just right at the top of the hour. So it's perfect timing.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for attending, and thanks for those of you who are able to share. It's always nice to hear from people who are living and breathing this every day in the real world. So, and have a great Thanksgiving, everybody. We'll see you after that.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.